entirely.
No, but the video. But the video was good.
Keep them open, please. Those.
So this is fine, probably. Yeah.
Just some connection to the real world, I thought would be helpful on an occasion like this. Welcome everybody to this session with Aernout. Thank you, Aernout, for joining us. It's been quite a challenging day so far, and you know, every time we had two parallel sessions, and we keep hearing all those rumors what happened in the other room where I wasn't, and I obviously missed the fact that there is already a functioning, running definition of former West that was established. Dimitri's laughing. He knew what it was. That came out of the conversation within the workshop that the students themselves prepared, the students that we work together with in the group Becoming Former West. So I'm quite curious that we enter into that terrain in our conversation. For now, I have great pleasure to welcome and introduce, if at all necessary, Aernout, artist who lives in Amsterdam, works everywhere around the world, I dare to say. In the morning you heard an introduction of his parts of his professional biography. I had a great privilege to be able to work with Aernout twice on relatively large projects. One was production at BAC in 2006. We produced two wonderful pieces together, raw footage, which we will look at this afternoon, and Scapegoats. And in 2007 we worked together towards, or we realized together a Dutch pavilion at the Venice Biennale under the title Citizens and Subjects. Quite complex project that consisted of the exhibition and new project of Aernout in the pavilion in Venice, series of lectures and talks in Utrecht in collaboration with the university, and a reader. We didn't publish a catalog, but we published a critical reader. I have it just to be able to quote a couple of things, titled Citizens and Subjects, the Netherlands, for example. These collaborations, but of course the entire oeuvre of Aernout has been quite important for me in thinking about former West. His works that are mainly, of course recently mainly the non-narrative videos, in a very particular way hint into developments in the society, into something that one could call problematic developments in the society. Think of war, for example, like in raw footage. Economic crisis, one could say, violence, constant fear that is being maintained, but by power that be in order to enforce control within Western societies. Violence at schools, for example, the notion of the return of religion through certain ideas implemented and or palpable in his work. So I thought it would be quite exciting to try to debate those shifts from the so-called West towards potentially former West. Try to debate it through his practice, try to identify certain moments through which we could gain some understanding into what these shifts could potentially be, what could they potentially mean. And a question that I myself struggle with and don't have an answer or definition to, what's got art to do with all this? And I think it's very fair and important, however very difficult question that we need to try to answer, especially if we are the frame operating or discussing within the framework of contemporary art, and in particular art academy like Rietveld Academy is. This is an informal conversation. We haven't scripted this. We just chose that we would like to show 4 pieces. We kind of agreed on it instantly without actually understanding what we were doing. I think we tried to, in retrospect or in kind of reverse engineering, find logic in that selection. We'll show Middleman, raw footage, training ground, and schoolyard. These 4 pieces we'll show and try to debate around these 4 issues. However, every unscripted conversation has to have a first question that the people at the table agree on, and I tried with Aernout. I wanted to ask him what was he doing in 1989 and how he recognized the change. I'll not pose that question because the answer would be from his private life, having his East German girlfriend traveling freely to see him in Amsterdam, and I think we're gonna keep this outside of our conversation this afternoon.
Very happy about that.
You know, it's not always about being happy. So I thought instead of that first question to kick off some sort of direction for this afternoon, we could screen a little bit of Middleman, which is the work from 2001,
Yeah.
and it's the work that's remarkably acute if you look at it from today's perspective, and immediately one has the feeling that you can connect it to current economic crisis, although to stress this is the work from 2001 and does not talk about the circumstances of the current crisis, but kind of in its own artistic way tries to articulate the Western condition in general. But we'll debate after we will have seen a little bit of that piece. See whether Macintosh collaborates with us.
Yeah, a few remarks from me about Middleman. The piece is indeed made in 2001, just about a month or 2 months before September 11. It's been really kind of a strange piece because September 11 happened right after it, and wasn't, of course, I didn't foresee that happening, but it was after September 11 happened. It was impossible to look at the piece without having that break in history kind of in mind, although it was absolutely not my intention. Middleman, I think it's kind of interesting that we start. I mean, let's say the Formal West project starts, of course, from the period after '89, but I think the works we show now start from around 2000. And I think this has been, at least in my work, a kind of a shift, because I think during the 90s, slowly kind of, if I'm talking about Western Europe or about Holland, I think slowly kind of changes, or kind of hidden changes seems to kind of be built up, a certain tension kind of built up. And although I wasn't completely fully aware of it, but somehow in my work at the end of the 90s and towards the turn of the kind of century, the whole idea of crisis and of disaster, of catastrophe became kind of a main kind of subject. And and I think Middleman is kind of a very good example of that, with this whole idea of exhaustion of something, of a system that comes to kind of to an end. I think this is just. I will show it with Middleman, and also with the other pieces. I will show today. I'll show fragments of it because they are. Some people will know that they are often quite long pieces, and they have no. Not a traditional developing narrative, so they also don't have a beginning and an end. So I will pick somewhere in the middle a certain part that I will ask you to look at, and we show it for a certain amount of time, because I think if you only see like one very short fraction of it, you don't get really the. You don't understand really the way it works. Okay, there we go. Let's see if this works. And this piece is, many of my pieces is without any sound.
when watching it, I realized that I've never seen middlemen like this, and we probably need to remind everybody in the room that it's always a video installation. Is that always correct, or are there exceptions?
No, in that sense, not that. I mean, it's never the situation like this where it has this kind of movie structure, and also I think the absence of sound, which becomes a very kind of awkward thing in this setup, is in the way it's been exhibited is kind of a more natural thing. Because I always, I mean, the work's always like an architectural part of the environment, so it's always opposite of you and on a very physical way. It's also always, this piece is mostly shown with a rear projection, and it's kind of touching the floor, so and has a kind of a human size, so there's always you're always like physically addressed by the work, by the bodies in the video. So there's always this kind of communication from one body to the other, and this is kind of a very essential part in all of the work, because it talks more about the gestures and about the way something travels from one body to the other and is taken over by each body. And this is also the way it communicates with the viewer or participant.
Is it looped or with a starting and an end?
It's looped, but you know it has never this, because it's basically it has a structure of that it's changing and being kind of staying in the same realm. So you don't know if you have seen it or you have not seen it. There's always this kind of feeling of loss somehow, or that you loss of control. There's always that it's kind of it's always like. It's bigger than you can control, so that means you're always like searching through the material, so you always have to be kind of being active and locating yourself in the material.
But it has such physical presence, you as a viewer actually become part of the situation that's unfolding on those physical architectural screens, right?
Right, yeah.
And that's an idea that you want us to realize that you're part of the constellation you're presenting, or?
Yeah, I mean that's. I think it's something which is taking place also inside the screen in a way. This kind of traveling from one to the other, so something that you're always kind of you're part of this environment and the behavior around you, and you kind of copy it by itself because it's there. And also I want to kind of because I want to talk through that language, make something clear through that language. I also address the viewer as a participant in that sense.
Was there any particular impulse that you can remember? What was it that made you make this piece in 2001 before this kind of dramatic change, if you can call it that way? As you refer to 9/11 yourself.
Yeah, I mean, why I made it, you mean before? Yeah, well, I mean, what I said, I was really digging in a lot of things that had to do with this kind of disastrous moment, but also I was very interested in the idea of entropy, of things kind of coming to an end, to a stop, to kind of I was, to me, it was not just what interested me in this piece was this whole idea of exhaustion as something that the whole acceleration in society always. The counterpart of that is the exhaustion, so it's kind of a natural part of the kind of the capitalist society. And what I try to look in this piece that if it comes to a kind of an extreme state, if it becomes really entropic, if it really everything goes down, if there could be kind of almost like a physical moment of kind of 0 point where things kind of get almost like on a biological level connected again, and there could become something else. I mean, this end point could also mark a kind of another beginning. That was a kind of a question I had for myself.
But is there any promise for a new beginning within this piece? I would have difficulty to identify. This is pretty disastrous.
Yeah, but to me there is a moment of kind of the silent moment of something disastrous happening, a silent moment where I think something is starting to get over, and when there is kind of a reconnection, kind of first almost like on a just on a material level, just a kind of beginning of a reconnection, but nothing formed in behavior or whatever in structure, but almost on a sedimentary level, in the sense of really on the most basic level you could start.
I wonder whether this piece really indicates a shift within your own practice, or shift in how your practice has been interpreted. Because I was not in the Netherlands in the 90s, and we didn't work together at that time. And I looked up a number of reviews, and it was quite striking to me that your work was always, until this point, somehow interpreted in the context of the individual psyche.
Yeah.
You know, it was always about crazy person doing something crazy. It was never read in the wider societal context. And I think with Middleman there starts to be, your work starts to be interpreted in connection to the developments in society and world at large. But if I look up your work from the 90s, it could easily happen so as well. So I wonder where the shift actually is.
I don't think there's fundamentally a shift between one and the other. I think when with this work and works around this time, I think of course because it was refers to more to images from the. I mean, it's in a broader public scale, so it's on the kind of spaces that either we know from the mass media or spaces. I mean, at least spaces that are not kind of private space anymore. The spaces I was focused on before were kind of more nondescript or more unclear where they were. So I make a direct reference, I think, to the society in general, in general here. But I think the fact that it's interpreted so differently in the 90s, I think, says more about the way criticism in Holland was kind of functioning, because it was looking very isolated at things, and so there was. I think you could, looking back, you could also interpret my older work in more in this kind of direction.
I'm sort of seeing art as being not connected to the world, being autonomous terrain of certain activity.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of that kind of
group of people.
strange concepts that were in kind of in the 80s and 90s kind of very dominant here. That there was that you could speak of kind of an autonomous art practice, which is I never understood what that really meant. Something can be isolated from something else? I mean, I think that's also part of the subject of the work, that something is never isolated from the rest.
Does the piece get shown nowadays a lot because of this kind of simplistic connection to the current economic
crisis? I've got a lot of of course, it's a lot of, because there are all these shows about the economy and stuff, and
flourishing.
They love to show it. But it's strange that, I mean, it also throughout the years, I mean, of course we're now in a big crisis, but we forget there was also a crisis before, and maybe a smaller crisis, but there has been always crisis all the time. So this whole idea of crisis is also a fundamental part of our society, although it's on a scale that is like unprecedented right now.
It's a kind of, reminder that's slightly disappointing, because if you talk about exhaustion of the system, but you know there has always been crisis, that crisis is capitalist system. And if you talk about opening towards another future, then it's opening to just another round, another cycle of
basically, of course, that's, I mean, historically that's mostly what has been happening, but it doesn't mean that it could mean that I don't think in a I don't think it's an eternal return. I think things are probably changing at the same time, but of course there's also a cyclic pattern that things kind of, that we think we think things are over, but they are in fact not over at all, and things are just shift slightly and just turn over again. And of course we never know if things are getting over or getting really to a different level. We don't. In that sense, we are in a dream state as well.
How would you, if we move briskly to another piece, raw footage of 2006. If here we talk about stock exchange turned wasteland, you talk about the wasteland of another kind in raw footage.
Yeah.
And there in raw footage you made a gigantic step towards another format of working, I think, if I may say so.
Mm-hmm.
Because for the first time ever in your artistic practice, you worked with existing documentary footage.
Yeah.
You want to say something about how raw footage came about?
Well, I mean, you asked me to make it.
I wish that was that simple.
Well, it's not. Yeah, I mean,
Certain things need to stay secret.
yeah, it's not completely untrue. I think because we were in discussion, there was this project concerning war done at BAC in 2005, I think, and I actually was already taking part in that project. And who was working with you also, that Brigitte van der Zande. I was in discussion with her, so how to, if it was possible to make a picture of war. And by then we had discussions where I also already hinted in that I was already walking around for a few years to kind of do research about this and about the way we, if we somehow could correct the way we normally in the media in the West look at war and consuming war. And if not something another level could be kind of digged out and could be get to the surface. And I was walking around for a long time already of doing this, and actually did not do it until I was really forced to do it. Anyway, I think that the piece, to me, it looks like a major step to do it like that. At the same time, I think it was when I was actually producing it, didn't feel so far away from my other practice. And I think one of the key things that led me to making it was this whole also the whole notion of what I call a bit abstractly the event and the non-event. So the relationship between something where you focus on what's in the focus and something what is like the periphery that is kind of left out there and you don't see, but it kind of it makes as much forms as much as the way reality is formed as what we call the event. So I was in many pieces I try to correct when I'm staging things. I try to correct also the attention to things that are kind of seem to be trivial in our experience, in our focus, and also in time. And this was also I was kind of had a hypothesis that in this image, in this situation of the way war is depicted, there must be something else that could be visible. So I started to do research on the that's also why it's called raw footage, on the real raw material that was shot in the war in Yugoslavia. So the material that really I got access to, really the tapes that were in the camera, so were completely non-edited. But I think the pieces their functions kind of on two levels for me. I mean, one is I think was also in relation to the problem of this discussion. Of course, the war in Yugoslavia in the 90s was a kind of an extreme, was like an enormous, had enormous impact. First of all, because I think we've suddenly realized. I suddenly realized that. And for instance, you first had the East. The East was something back there, and you suddenly realized that actually we share a history, and it's part of Europe, and it's extremely nearby, and so and at the same time we have like difficulty to kind of relate to it, to grasp it. So this whole.
I remember just to interrupt you. I remember Venice Biennial 1993, and I guess Venice is just a few hundred kilometers, 200, 300 kilometers from that area to help me. And from Belgrade or from Yugoslavia, definitely. And there was this circus of high art going on in Venice, designers' dresses and champagne and all of that, while there was real war going on, just a couple of corners further up. And that was quite remarkable for me how cynical and arrogant art world was at that point. There was no recognition whatsoever of real war conflict going on. So you said it was close, indeed, just around the corner from here, but at the same time quite far away.
Well,
in this kind
and I think it got really split in that we first, on one hand, we very suddenly realized, okay, this is part of, this is our kind of, this is
Our own history.
our own history. This is like, and secondly, like at the same time staying kind of on a distance. And then the other thing, I mean, of course, it's made in 2006. I mean, in that period, September 11 has been, and the war in Afghanistan, and so everything. This seems to have pushed the whole thing and what happened in Yugoslavia completely to the background, and something that's already far away in history, which was not at all the case.
That's what we believed in Cold War, that Cold War was the thing of the past.
Yeah.
Well, actually, nowadays it's just one of the instruments the West uses to renegotiate its position in the world.
And one of the other levels, I think, for me, that because the work is talking is really interpreting in a very general way the material. It's not making a specific explanation of how the conflict was taking place. And in a way, to me, it was also a study in uncertainty and kind of. Because you cannot really grasp very moments where is the war, what is exactly, and what is exactly taking place. So there's very little really harsh moments in.
But it comes through your editing, right? You're not interested in this shogun kind of images that show the real event of war. You interested in everything that's outside of it.
Yeah, but actually, if you could look at the raw material or what that was coming from the cameras, most of the material was not so shock and awe. So it was quite a correct interpretation of the material.
And the material came from
large like ITN work, just mostly. It's the big.
Did we buy it for commercial prices? What did we do?
Well, we got a discount. But I just want to stress that this. So there's also, in a way, I think I'd also try. Many of the works there are also, in a sense, unspecific in the sense that they try to describe a certain mental state, which says also something about us. And I thought also the whole idea of what was taking place was a civil war in Yugoslavia. That also it kind of said something about this insecurity and this kind of groups, that kind of the cohesion that is falling apart. It also kind of somehow is metaphoric for processes, developments that are taking place around us, just in what we call now West, or whatever we call it.
Can I touch upon how we got hold of that material? Because it was quite a unique moment where Reuters and ITN were kind of going through thousands of carton boxes with VHS tapes and with little camera tapes. They basically hired an intern to go through hours and hours of tapes and basically discard of everything which wouldn't have potentially commercial value. So if you imagine what stays in this kind of agencies are those brief couple of second excerpts that you see on the background when there's a news from somewhere or some kind of documentary film or something like that, just a couple of seconds, which is usually shock and awe kind of imagery, right? Mm-hmm. Like the more shooting and the more kind of dramatic images, the better. But this was the moment where you could go through those parts. I mean, this can sound brutal, but why we could get hold of that material, that it did not necessarily have that commercial value they were seeking for.
No, and also I think the luck was with this project is that the war in Yugoslavia was so overly covered that there was so much material collected that they were not able to kind of, because what they normally do, they collect material, then they cut. They cut like little parts that they think they might sell, have commercial value in the future possibly, and they put that on compilation tapes. Nowadays it's all digitized, but they were not. There was just too much material, and they were not able to go through all of it. And also, I think this is so. It was on one of the last moments that is actually that the flood of information is going like this, because now, because most of the material is now digital, made.
Mobile phones, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's a new. I mean, there's a kind of new round coming up where the kind of the function of the cameraman is disappearing now, because if you could see it in Iran, so there's a new era coming now because everyone becomes a cameraman now. So that's kind of a change.
Before we play an excerpt, I think while I interrupted about middlemen saying that this is shown differently, installed in a kind of architectural setting as a video installation, where your body becomes part of the story, as it were.
Yeah.
With documentary material, you have different strategy of showing this.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, this is work where the sound is included, and also very important. It's just because it's just there with the material, and there's absolutely no reason to kind of touch it. It is a double screen work. That means that it's important in the reception also that you kind of make this shift from one screen to the other and look at the combination of the two screens, and they have both. I normally show them on what we call sound screens. That means that each screen produces its own sound, right? It's coming out of this. The sound is coming out of the screen. That means if you have the two screens next to each other, you kind of physically relate the sound to the image, the materiality of the image, and they are kind of located inside of the image. You feel that they have like a direction. They don't spread out through the space, so they kind of they mix. They keep on being also separate. And this is important that you keep on making this kind of, it's not like one mess, but you kind of keep on making this kind of montage of one image related to the other all the time.
And you organize the images the flow of images in chapters within that structure.
Yeah, there are little kind of chapters. Sometimes it's black, a couple of seconds black in between, and I kind of made kind of a rough structure of. Sometimes it's more specific than other moments that there's certain kind of subjects that are structural structures that kind of are visible in the material. Like sometimes it's just the way people are lining up together, or sometimes it's about animals. You'll see some fragments of that animals that kind of appear. So they're all kind of different motives that kind of structure them. So sometimes more loose and sometimes more strict.
Show us.
Okay. Put it a bit always full screen. A bit forward. One second.
Do you recognize anything? I saw Russian.
Još jednom ponovimo šta je bilo naprijed kada broj, tada ćemo znači pod njegovim voće i ljudi iz toga i neposredno podeljenje. Sve prvo šume raspored na uznanje, a mislim da je komandir Petir.
Ovdje sim, kako je malo? Sim ovdje.
Ne, to su dve ženke. Ovo trojče da šutke u prirodu. Sada samo da tako, neću
Unfortunately, I have no chance to see the entire piece, but there are for the work to unfold. But I think to some extent it's also strategy to be seen in your work. This kind of long takes, long shots of something that comes across as inaction. You know, there's always really long time, people waiting, people wandering aimlessly, not only in these images but also in your own stage work. And you know, it's quite possible that one confuses which work is yours and which is real documentary material at some point. It's always a crowd of people seemingly engaged in a kind of aimless activity, as if waiting for something to happen. Or am I misreading that?
I mean, I think it was important for me to create in this work this kind of ambiguity, but also I think the essence is really this relationship between normality and extremity. That they're both kind of taking place at the same time. This is kind of so crucial for, I mean, maybe for war, but or maybe also for our current condition. I think what we normally, when we look at this kind of extreme footage or anything that is from somewhere abroad, where we get news footage, that is never. We never have the pace of time which resembles our own pace of time in the way we just in the way we look at it, in the way we spend time during the day. So I want to restore something of what is kind of maybe looks boring, but maybe is on the other hand just kind of very normal pace of time. So I also try to match the pace of time of the viewer again with the material once more, instead of only in highlighted intensity, so that they also can, in that sense, kind of start to be able to relate again to each other.
But the effect of that strategy can be that actually the shootage is demystifying the war.
Sorry?
It could be that actually that strategy that you use is actually demystifying the war as such.
Demystify?
Yeah.
Yeah,
because you understand the war as something really fast.
No.
Happening.
No, because there is a distance that is created in between the viewer and the shootage, and that's such a huge distance.
Here you mean?
Yeah. That actually actuality and perspective is lost in that distance that you establish.
I
I understand this is a part of your work.
I experienced opposites really of that. Yeah. That's because my experience is also that people get really captivated by it, and by the fact that they can somehow, although they don't know what they exactly relate to, there's a certain uncertainty, but actually it grabs them to be with the material.
I'm not.
No, I mean,
I'm not looking for some blood and shocking images, not at all.
No,
we had enough of those.
Yeah.
But just when I look at this material now, yeah. I experience this huge distance that I actually don't care, even though I come from that area.
Yeah.
But it's what this piece is kind of teaching me or showing to me is that actually it doesn't matter.
But I disagree.
And I just wonder if this is something that you plan to do or something, which could be actually quite a good point.
Let's always disagree.
It'd be a good point.
Well, I mean, I because you even say you yourself that it might be boring, but I'm not bored for a second, and I'm actually quite shocked.
How normal war can be.
No, but I don't find it normal at all when I see this. I mean, you feel this constant war going on, even though people are. I mean, you see a pig running around that's been shot in the butt. People are dealing with weapons all the time. I mean, even though it's maybe not fast, it's still war and it's still shocking to me. Yeah.
Well, this was one of those exhibitions where people would laying down on the ground at Buck for hours. And the show would be closing, they would be begging us, can we extend as long as you work upstairs in the offices, can we just watch? People would engage at 70-something minutes, 76, do I remember it well? I don't remember how long it is.
It's 1 hour and 15 minutes or something.
So right, 75 minutes that is looped, and people would stay because they are captivating images. They are, we have no chance to show it, but it's, for me, maybe it doesn't come across as normal, but for me, the normality actually comes to the fore in some way. People learn to live with war somehow. You have the feeling that you must. I mean, we're lucky with the privileged ones, not having experienced this. But you have this imagination that you're constantly in a bunker hiding from the bombs. But then there are shots that we haven't seen today. But people sit in a cafe in a semi-ruined building, while in parallel, there are soldiers running to do something, or there's this shot with it's impossible to start talking and picking up on these subjects, but it's, in my opinion, quite remarkable work. However, as I just mentioned, that we're lucky not having experienced something like this in reality in our own, environment and life. How is it? Is it possible? Some people would protest that if you didn't experience war, it's simply impossible.
No, I mean, in that sense, it's also. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have not been in a war. I'm very happy I've not been in a war. And,
but I think, sorry, I'm
go ahead.
interrupting, but it's not about experience of being in war or not being in a war.
Yeah.
It is about the load that the image is communicating.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, in that communication between me as a viewer and this image, how much the banality of the image plays the important role for you. That's all what I'm...
I mean, it's for me very important that this moment of banality occurs all the time, and I think this is also, for me, this is an entrance to that situation.
Yeah, that's great, good part of the work. But then, why then to restage it in Scapegoats?
Sorry?
Why then to restage it again in Scapegoats? That's my question, actually.
Okay, I don't.
Can I just make an introduction? Scapegoats is another work produced on the subject of war. I don't believe there was a restaging of that piece, of this piece.
I mean, not this piece, but the moments of those that you showed.
There was
right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Scapegoat is made to kind of look again at Western Europe, at my situation here, and try to visualize something which a possible situation of civil war in this context, and that's kind of the reason to make it and to look at it. It's not a restaging of that, not at all. But there are some echoes of almost like memories of that situation, because
that's what visually looks like. Sure.
There are some moments that kind of refer to it, but there are almost like, if we visualize a war here, if we could somehow in the collective memory, this kind of recent wars play a role in that, and they're part of our imagination of that, of this, also of the fantasy of what a civil war could be here.
So it's a lot about fantasy and perception of what you think about war. I mean, you don't have to be in a war, or you don't have to experience a war to look at these images and find them terrifying in its banality.
But where I was hinting at is that, and Susan Sontag wrote a lot, like how dare you as an artist to either speak about war or try to depict war if you have no clue what that is, right? So that's about ethical stance. It's one of those potential colonial attitudes. I live here in this safe haven of whatever, but I tell you what the war is, and I think this piece manages to circumvent that problem.
But it's also because it are actually images from there, filmed by somebody there.
But it's filmed by people from here going there,
and it's also
so it's already.
I just want to ask you then something like picking up a little bit on this, because it's kind of the context of showing the two pieces, of course, is this context here, but nevertheless, I'm asking that question to see where it goes. So I think there's two big differences that struck me between the two pieces. The first one is that the first piece happens in West, whereas the second one, this one, happens in the East. Yeah. And the second difference from which I would like you to pick it up is that the first piece is everything is centered around an invisible reference, right? And there's all this entanglement of gazes and visual gestures and bodily gestures that point towards that invisible object that is never shown. So it's almost as if, it's almost as if the piece is kind of mourning, say, the loss of the visual object within the practice of a visual artist, which you are. Quite the contrary happens with the second piece, where it seems actually that the camera cannot stop shooting everything. Everything is worth showing. There's an abundance of things to be shown out, to be shown, pointed eventually out, from like the preparation of the ammunition to pigs and bears. It's like a bazaar, in a way, right? So I wonder what makes that difference. Is it the location, the difference between the East and the West? Is it the war? What makes that difference between the loss?
Can I intervene? Yeah. You said everything is worthwhile showing. No, everything is worthwhile recording.
Right.
What's shown is carefully selected. Remember this kind of anecdotal image, how images are selected in commercial companies, right? Should Aernout not pick this up, it would definitely not be worth showing because it has no commercial value in that respect, right?
But this also points to another difference that plays to this contrast that I'm interested in, namely in the first piece, again, with the invisible object and all, the scenario, if you put it this way, the narrative behind it is more obvious. Yeah. Right? Here, the balance, even if, the point is recording, the balance still, is tilted towards the visual, right? The worthiness of showing actually those objects as visual, as a visual experience, right? Worth recording, showing, maybe pointing at. That depends on the watcher, right? So it is this complete, say, contradiction that I'm interested in. What makes this difference into such a difference?
Hold your horses. I looked at the watch. And I wanna keep this question in discussion. However, we showed two pieces out of incredible big oeuvre of Aernout, and of course, if you see two pieces, you tend to compare. And I don't necessarily believe that this should be happening before we see other pieces.
Yeah,
but if you wanna,
you're very short. I do think he made it's a very good point because I think it's it's too obvious now to say this one is the West and the other is the East, because I think it's also a trajectory in time in my work, because there's like 5 years in between. And I think the middleman, I think around that time I was very busy with this idea of mourning, of things that, this impossibility of the grasp of visual, the kind of things you describe. And I think throughout the throughout the years afterward, it changed more into the accumulation of moments, of these endless accumulation of moments that are kind of worth depictable, and none of it is the dominant one, and they're all kind of important. And also that kind of brought kind of the whole idea of action and mobility kind of back into the work somehow. It kind of popped up. I think it pops up maybe in the next work. Yeah.
Let's move to training ground to try to see as much as possible before we discuss things further. Training ground is the work from 2006, 2007, if I'm correct. It's not documentary footage. It's one of the staged pieces where Aernout works with a large crowd of actors, both amateur and professional actors, filmed in a non-location somewhere in Germany. Hard to identify location, although everybody immediately notices it's not in the Netherlands. And the idea is the notion of how do we train policemen and custom officers to go about with refugees, sans-papiers, people without papers. The question at all is, do we train anybody to go about with refugees? If we do train people, how do we train them? What happens? I think.
Wait, there's something strange.
I think I can just continue saying a couple of things.
Start at the beginning.
Large group of actors divided into particular groups through how they're dressed, right? Through dress code, you have policemen or representatives of power, and then you have refugees on the scene, and then you have truck drivers, right? Can I be so simplistic to?
Yeah, almost. I mean, you would say that.
Quick?
Yeah, okay. Well, they're refugees, but at the same time, they're kind of. They could also be stand-ins. They're kind of in between. So you don't, and there's a group of truck drivers, and it's not completely clear why they are there. Say it like that.
I think it's quite clear. Shall we talk, or shall we have this run and concentrate a bit on the?
Let's just look first a bit, maybe later talk through it. It's important. I mean, I will show a few parts because it goes through different stages. Really,
although there's no narrative. Really.
There's no narrative, but it shifts from certain levels, from intensity, and also in a way of setup. And it starts kind of a more in a documentary sense almost, and later it kind of goes beyond that.
And were the images stacked like this in the installation?
No, so you're right. I have to explain that they're next to each other, yeah, which is also important.
And on the floor again, so it gets this kind of.
This one is top left and bottom right.
Yeah, but it's very impossible to make up that up in your mind now. It's just because of otherwise the images would be so small. Yeah.
Are they in a screening room, like both works you said, which are like architectural, like built in the
The screens embedded into the floor, so they're approximately your size, slightly smaller than your size, right? And they are in the...
Yeah, I mean, it varies a bit when I exhibited it, but basically they're next to each other, close to each other, and they are touching the floor, so they're resting on the floor, so they have this kind of physical relationship again with the viewer.
But in a open space, like where people pass by, or like in a room where people have to go and they stay?
But that
depends
really on.
This is also shown in the Van Appen Museum?
Yeah.
After the Venice Biennial was in the pavilion and then... just let's the images run, and let's try to talk about this piece. I think what's important to say, perhaps, that within your productions you work with large numbers of people, always actually, but they don't work with a script, right? Mm-hmm. They assign certain roles through how they are dressed. And then then you kind of orientate the movement of people on the set. Mm-hmm. There's a slight exception here because you instructed few people with a quote from another filmic production. Mm-hmm. Could you say something about that of Mad Masters?
Yes, so there's a direct reference to a film from Jean Roux, ethnographic film Jean Roux, called Les Maîtres Fous, Mad Masters.
From the 50s.
Yeah. And I kind of infected it a bit with some reference to it, although I must say, I will explain that later a bit about that film, but I must say I gave a few hints to a few people on the set, but they don't have knowledge of that film, you know. So there are some elements of it, but it's also completely took its own way during the shoot. So I didn't want to kind of copy that film either. So there are just some elements of it, and for me, as a reference to it. But it just because I never, when I'm working with people, I'm never also. There's always this mixture of that I'm kind of directing or in control and complete loss of control. So there's always a double activity there for me and them at the same time. So I didn't want to never give a literal image of play this or play that. So there were some hints in that direction, but what's taking place in The Maîtres Fous from Jean Roux. But that's about it. And even at the same time, also there was only a small group of people inside this group that were kind of instructed in this way, and the others kind of took it over in the shoot itself without kind of getting any real instruction there. So it's also something which is coming just from the set. It's being created on the set, really, and from the set. My interest in Le Maître Fou, the reference to Le Maître Fou was that in Le Maître Fou there is, just to say it very briefly, it's a film about the sects from people from Niger, and I think they're in Ghana. And they have this in the Hauka sect, and it's a spirit possession sect. They get possessed, but they get possessed by spirits from the colonial suppressor. So not from any kind of native god or figure. And they take over roles from they have a kind of a ritual, which is also very theatrical. There's a lot of combination of violence and humor. It's very exaggerated, and they take over. So they take the roles of the colonial suppressors. There's a colonel. There's a doctor, and all the French doctor, and all these kind of figures that they enact a certain kind of play, something between a ritual and a play.
Hauka movement is basically an instance of resistance to colonialism.
Well, this is how it's interpreted as that it was to be possessed by these spirits as a way to kind of deal with the trauma of the colonization, but also to overcome it, and also even to overtake the power from the colonial suppressor. And I mean, it was also very the authorities has been really forbidden from the early start, and seen as something very subversive. And there's a clear reference to that film from Jean Roux. Yeah.
Was that an acted film? Just remember that I think the narrator built up this story which wasn't actually fitting to what the original ritual should be, but I'm not sure if the whole scenery was sort of a play.
Well, I mean, it's a documentary. So it's a documentary about that ritual of the Hauka movement. But but the ritual itself has elements of a play. There's something. There's a theatrical dimension. There's also almost like an artificial dimension to it. It's very hard to tell what exactly is taking place. So. Also for us too, what is really the nature of this procession and how much is enacted and how much is kind of lived through and how much is enacted.
But I think the key moment in that ritual is that the group of Hauka followers gather together and they split the roles, right, between the colonized and the colonizers. And halfway the ritual, they swap the roles. So those who experience to be subjected to the suppressive power of the colonizers become the colonizers themselves. So the capacity to switch different perspectives into the story of suppression.
I'm not sure if that in the Hauka movement, in the ritual itself, they switch roles, but the fact of the activity, the ritual itself is already a swapping of roles. I mean, it's a start.
The power of the colonization forces. So the locals become like the colonel on all this. Like high positions, and they can be them for like it takes a whole day or something.
Yeah, it's to learn how to mobilize your own powers within the situation of suppression.
Yeah, but it's also a parody, and it's also radicalization of the rituals of power. So, and this is something which I kind of kind of infected this work with. That's, I mean, it starts. I mean, I say it starts, but of course it doesn't have a real start. But there's some periods where it's very rigid structure, almost like a documentary feeling, and then the roles. Then it gets kind of the role starts to dissolve completely in this kind of transgressive behavior, and then the roles start to swap. I mean, and then it comes back again. So it switches kind of from all this one level to the other all the time.
And that's what you actually see here happening on the set.
Yeah. So for me, it was a piece that there's a certain kind of way I felt there's a certain tension of building up a situation which just can't go on and it kind of implodes. I mean, there's a kind of extreme accumulation of tension, and it just it kind of implodes, and all these kind of things start to kind of get into motion, and and this whole organization of this kind of specific roles is becoming kind of fluid.
And it's called training ground, but of course it's not a real training. It's an imagination of the training. It's exercise of a potential training, right? Like the kind of divorce from reality, whatever that is happening in a number of stages, right? Stages.
Yeah, I mean, the works often have this kind of structure of a training or a simulation of something artificial, something like a model of something that the same as that with the Hauka movement. That's a kind of the setup of this ritual, where within this kind of isolated situation, there's something enacted to kind of, in a way to kind of mimic it and to deal with it and to kind of influence it maybe.
Cannot not mention the two key essays that probably that instantly come to my mind in relation to this one. Two essays with the same title, "We Refugees," by Hannah Arendt in the 50s, and Giorgio Agamben. The year I would need to search somewhere in the papers, but 50 years after Hannah Arendt, actually saying that the person of the refugee is the expression, the epitome of the man of the late 20th century. Unless we understand the refugee in every of us, every person, we're not able to understand the world the way it's changed by now. However, I remember Sarad Maharaj, a thinker, curator, in one of his talks at Bach, put Hannah Arendt and Giorgio Agamben under pressure, saying, this is 20th century view on what is the epitome, what is the expression of who is the man par excellence that symbolizes our times. It's no longer a migrant, it's no longer a refugee, it's a terrorist. because as the 20th century ended, we realized that the rule that would embrace the differences failed. Now, while I would be able to kind of empathize with the figure of refugee, as Arendt and Agamben suggest, it's quite difficult to do the same with the figure of terrorists. But it's something really remarkably important to take into consideration. And I am trying to build a very fast bridge, cut the corner really in a bad way to get us to view the last work. So we're going to shift. Yeah. We have 20 minutes left for overall. Okay. We need to really be quick. But I wonder whether the last piece we're going to show, Schoolyard, that I only seen partially once. So I'm quite looking forward to this premiere also in my professional life. It's the piece produced last year, 2009, for the exhibition at MoMA. It looks at a context of middelbare school, am I right? In the Netherlands. And from here you need to take it over to explain what we're going to look at.
Yeah, well, this is
that's
wrong.
Sorry,
that's wrong. Sorry. Yeah, again, you will only be able to see fragments of it because it's a long piece again. It's also a double screen, which is. So it's taking place in let's say vocational schools, so not a middelbare school, not an early high school for where you stay trained for professions. Although it's not completely specified what it is, and it's shot in Amsterdam. It's a reflection of how the community on these schools is made up these days. One school. I just have to move it, but it's a very long piece, so I will show you just a few fragments. It's again double screen, what I said. And
these are all actors?
No, I never. I mean, there's sometimes some actors in the work, but I'm always working a lot with non-actors or semi-actors. So these are partly people from the school. They're also partly from there. It's a group made up out of one hand reflecting this kind of school, but it's also like often with my piece. It's not a complete full image. I mean, there is also some people from the richer neighborhoods in here, from the Amsterdam Zuid, but there are also some Moroccan kids from Rotterdam that I brought into this Amsterdam context. So it's a very kind of quite of interesting group of people. Again, what happens is that there are certain roles. For instance, there are guards, there's some teachers, but also during the piece, also this kind of starts to dissolve very quickly. That means that also this, let's say, also the differences in ethnic. They're also, everything is kind of at some point, which is really important for me for the piece. Doing together. There's no kind of there's kind of outbursts of violence or change of play into violence, all kind of transformations going on through the crowd, but they're mostly kind of collective. It's not one group opposite of another. It's kind of a collective experience. What happens throughout the piece is that I think one of the motives is this constant transformation all the time, and there's this certain points where it kind of crystallizes in that some kind of the locality changes into kind of a global image. So there are always kind of things that suddenly refer to a completely different scale and different situations that kind of come to the surface within this scenery.
How did you narrow the actions? How did you make them do what they do?
I mean, I always work with very long takes, so there's always this kind of this process of that. I mean, let's say the kind of intoxication of kind of forgetting what's going on. I mean, I'm giving instructions during the shoot, but because we go on and go on, I give kind of motives, but the thing is also enacted by the people themselves, and also things because. Let's say there's over 100 people here. I'm not able to direct 100 people on the spot.
Part is also improvised.
Yeah, it is. So I'm affecting it, but I'm not in control. So it's something like that. And
there are things that happen on the set without your control. I've been in one such shooting, and I was like, "This is complete chaos. There's no way there can be an artwork produced out of this." Right? So you stand there and absolutely, and then. Arnold's instruction would be walk in circles, and they start working in circles, but it becomes either boring or too funny. And there's something, there's a sparkle, and action happens. And
sometimes it can be very basic instructions, at least to get something going, and then something else comes out of it. Of course, in this piece, there were particularly motives that I kind of created, that at certain point in put there, that it had to crystallize in, but then these are just kind of moments that kind of pop out of this kind of stream.
It's better to stay in a group all the time, because you just mentioned that they have to stay. They stay in a group all the time.
I mean, if there are 100 people in a schoolyard, they are in group. Whatever they do, you can only if you walk through the streets, you're out of it. So, and the other hand is the other thing is that I'm also not in complete control of the cameras. Because it's there's so much going on that also the cameras can look for moments that I'm not even. Aware of, and so it's just, and I think what is kind of important in the way it works that and my experience is if I work with people that there's after quite a short time there's a certain kind of organism kind of, I mean it goes kind of by itself, and there's also organism of with everybody kind of it creates a certain direction of this is. That says this is correct and that is like incorrect or something, and it's you cannot put your finger on it, but it just happens, and it has its own kind of makes its own kind of sense. And
it looks like quite a subtle balance between if you see the works together with the indifference and with activity or the caricature related to daily life, and when it's becoming too absurd, and the balancing of which is in the thing about the war, when there is some indifference on the spot, only looking, like you were talking about the taxi, the chauffeurs, the bus chauffeurs, and drivers, and which is a strange element, but which is very important because it's not activity all the time, and we watch it as observation. Yeah. And I find it quite a heavy thing when I look at it, the balance thing with. When it becomes too caricatural, or when it's linked enough with daily life, and that's really the strong. I think that's really a strong thing of your work. Right? When war is happening there, and there is that daily life indifference or something like that, and I find it a very difficult thing with the staged thing, because there's so much urge when we act to do a thing and not to be passive. And I think the inactive thing, or the hypnotizing thing with that, how we observe violence and how we observe the world, is quite, that's quite the thing which is in my mind when I watch your work, how to find a good balance with it, and the suspense of the situation, and when it's really suspense, or when is it one by one with reality.
You called character. Yeah, I think. I think the artificiality is also kind of, in a way, an essential part. That it's on this edge of that things start to. That is kind of this feeling of what you call indifference, or kind of any that's kind of or what you could see as a very intense moment that it's kind of suddenly can appear and it can disappear again. I think this is also with when I work in the staged way of people in the staged way. What I find interesting that there is kind of a construction, but it's suddenly taken over by something else. It's something like a documentary moment or something, which is makes completely sense on that moment. It starts to appear, and that I find that. So I think the work kind of moves from between those poles, and of course when it doesn't stop, when it stops moving between those poles, it's not effective. But I do think this whole idea of construction, and almost like in a sense of a Brechtian sense, is kind of important to it as well.
That's what, like this work and the documentary, like found footage work, have for me like this in common, that also here you like film, you instruct a certain like a basic rule or whatever, but after a while it gets its own dynamic and you let loose. And I'm not sure how many material you shoot in general and how much you actually select then.
Because editing is the key.
Exactly,
this,
like the documentary material, it's also about the selection of the material, and here it's the same. You take out maybe moments of totally unorganized or like in staged moments where everything gets just its own life and its own sort of dynamic.
But I think you also see the difference between Middleman and these later works, because in Middleman it's much more clear that it's staged, it's much more theatrical, it's one take, you don't have the edits in it, and it becomes more and more towards this ambiguity.
I had a question also about the camera work. What the one work you didn't show, the vacuum room. The rules are very clear for the camera, or very clear.
Well, they're mechanical. The cameras there.
What?
The cameras in vacuum room are mechanical. I mean, there's no cameraman there.
That's clear why it is like that.
Yeah.
So the rules are set in that sense.
Yeah.
But I wondered with these works. Also the amount of cameras you use and the way how they work together and how they relate to each other with the images. I wondered how, did you make up rules, or did it just, was it more?
I mean, what I did here is very technically, I shot with two cameramen, but both cameramen have a double camera. So as you can see here, this is from the same point of view. I made this combination of that. You sometimes extend one kind of point of view. I mean, like I split into kind of two parts that is kind of different framing, but from the same angle. And then I sometimes break it up between two different angles. So there are kind of four cameras, two cameras, this makes it. I'm kind of moving between kind of more panoramic feeling of kind of where you can start to control it and something being more in control of the imagery to a completely fragmented way of perception. So I kind of try to combine those two attitudes. Yes.
With your movies or the themes and movies, could they also be performed in real life?
Sorry.
So
could you speak up? It's like that.
Could you imagine that the movies would be translated to performances in real life, that you have some people walking around with a telescope, yours trying to change the atmosphere in an actual space, or is it?
Well, no, not really, because I think part of what I try to do is exactly to kind of forget also that it is a recording and that it is a. So I try to work. I try to shoot in that way that something is taking place that is kind of out of control, and that this kind of documentary moment kind of starts to appear. When I would direct someone to go into a space and do something, it would be really something enacted in the space, something in full control, in the hope to affect the surrounding. So to me, that would be quite a different thing.
But it would be quite interesting actually to lose control also in public space, or to cause this disruption, which is...
Yeah, well, maybe you can make it.
There you go. There's a question, please go on.
At which point on set, because you create these landscapes for people to kind of go wild, if you will, at some point, although albeit controlled, at which point do you think, has there ever been a point where it got too chaotic, where you intervened?
Yes, absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Because you build these landscapes where they they interact with each other and they, there's tension there, and it starts out with something that they're acting, but sometimes people think, it's
no, exactly, and also I was never interested to in this case also I had to kind of stop at a certain point. That means that I was interested in the way one transforms into the point where something transforms into the other, where the play transforms in violence or indifference in changed into a heightened sense of reality. I wasn't interested in violence as such, so I didn't. Wasn't in the intention to depict that, but only in this kind of transformative moment. So. In this case, yes, I had to stop it.
So you stopped it before they would fight?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
I think it's interesting as a participant of the films, as an actor or semi-actor or whatever. As it gets at a certain point out of control or out of this staged way, and it gets its own dynamic.
Yeah.
How the experience will be that you actually start to forget after a while that you're part of this film set, and that you actually try to get over in the more powerful positions of the thing. That if you are that free that they, for example, can change the roles without you telling them. That they actually much more people try to be in the more powerful role than in the devout role. So. I could imagine that people try to be, in case you have the guards, like before in the film with the training court.
Yeah, training ground, yeah.
That they try to be more in the role of the police guys and of the...
Of course, yeah. Yeah, but in a way, in this species, everyone is in power. That's kind of the big difference between the groups. And there's this kind of... It's made up of all these different parts that are kind of under tension now in our society, but in fact it's a collective kind of rehearsal here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Since as soon as you get into the realm of a stage reality, you get into the realm of representation, right? So, in which way the elements that I guess you've inserted in the scenario? So the wooden weapons in the previous one. Here you have some puppets and some other elements. In which way you have inserted these elements, since they can very easily acquire a symbolic value, and not only a tool for the action to happen, but also a symbolic value. So, in which way you inserted these elements?
Well, I mean, in case of the wooden weapons, it was a direct reference. I mean, there was first of all a reference to Jean Roux, of course, to this very specific work. On the other hand, it was this whole idea of training, of something which is not. It's like as if, this whole, to kind of emphasize this element that it is not. It's a rehearsal or a simulation or a training. It is like not the real thing. In case here of the puppet, I mean, it is very clearly that it was the intention to bring some kind of global kind of Middle Eastern aspect or into the schoolyard, which is like a kind of also a kind of to kind of change one realm, one dimension into the other, and or let this kind of this kind of world dimension, which is also very present also on the school in this situation, to kind of bring it kind of more clearly to the surface.
I'm afraid I will have to try to wrap this up, and I promised in the beginning I'd like to kind of find at least one answer as to what's art's role in contemporary world, what's its role in helping us identify the shift from the so-called West towards the former West. Is there somebody on this side of the room that would want to try to find such conclusion? I think it's something very important to remember, and throughout the course of the semester, it's a very small question at the end of the talk. Is that what somebody said? Throughout encounters with the students, you realize that we need to be very careful in dividing the role of art political activism from that of the political art or the political in art. Of course, those roles are not too easy to to distinguish so swiftly, but generally art/political activism would have a function identified in the beginning of any action in terms of its usefulness, right? I want to achieve this particular thing. And sometimes aesthetic strategies are very much part of this kind of purpose articulated within political and activist strategies. But I would probably hate art that would be purposeful in that way, that we would see as an instrument to achieve something. But still, I think we're facing responsibility to identify what's the place of art in this entire story. And I do not have an answer, right? That's why I pose it as a question. And if anybody wants to try, yes.
I came up with this thought that somehow I see that you kind of, for me, pointing out a certain side of the human nature in a certain situation. So maybe in a certain environment, in a certain critical situation, this kind of human nature comes out. And yeah, that's what I see.
That's great, thank you. Anybody else wants to add something?
Yeah, I think that what is happening with the image or with the artwork is partly slowing down. The quickness of the purpose you were mentioning, and where you have to come in a mentality where you slow down, or you are hypnotized by a situation, or that indifference, if we meet that also in our daily life, it's coming very nearby about politics or about big situations. And like we have the firemen at 11th September, and when we have this documentary thing, which is silly, which is slowing down, which is strange material that in a way comes nearby this work, comes nearby how we have to have an attitude. I like it really very much when in art there's a thin border between documentary material, which gives an inactive thing to things in our life, and we feel that we are more aware of that, a hypnotizing situation. And I think that is something which we can underestimate easily when we go too quickly into the purpose thing.
Right.
I think the poetic atmosphere, which is not aesthetic, but which is linking to the difficulty we meet in our daily life when we have to choose, or when we what makes evil banal, and dealing with that. Also when it's big issues, and how we can variate with that. The material of this work makes that very clear for me.
Thank you. There's another couple of hands, one in the very corner.
I cannot, because this week the Dutch stands central with this rhizome, and this really I find comes forward in the making sand, where the chaotic comes through, and trying to decompose and trying to find this singularity, what is this situation, and but not saying what it is, but leaving the interpretation open for the viewer to make this interpretation of the scene. And that I think there for me lies the strength, that if I look at the image, which is installation wise, I can make my interpretation upon and what it is, and what when you put these factors together.
Great, thank you. There's another hand up.
Yeah, I didn't have so much of an answer to that particular question, like how do we as artists, or how does art deal with this issue at Far West, but more kind of response to what you quoted Sontag, if I remember you correctly, as saying, how dare you as an artist talk about the war? And I would just say, how dare we as artists not talk about the war in a broader sense?
I like that, thank you.
But I think this talking about war is more like giving your like specific opinion about a war, and then like probably I mean a similar thing like you said. It's more this open perspective. You create this like environment which is almost totally neutral, and like banal, if it sounds a bit negative, but it gets its own dynamic without any direction and without that you have to like force your own opinion through the images towards us. So it gives you just the freedom to see whatever you want, and just makes you start thinking about whatever you see in it, and that's what I think is the strength. That also this openness of giving you the possibility to see your own.
Just sometimes too much of openness produces echo. That's the problem.
An echo.
Yeah.
Okay, well, can you explain the echo to me?
Echo means
it's like there's a tautology. You repeat the same.
Yeah,
you mean?
exactly.
Yeah.
But the openness is a problem, or
I'm just saying, sometimes can produce echo.
I think I would hate art that is being prescriptive.
No, of course.
You know, the openness
Don't
is
do it.
please not.
Yeah.
And I think that's for me, good work of art needs to do two things simultaneously, and this is what we regularly discuss throughout meetings with the group of Former West. I think it needs to, on one hand, disclose certain things in society that perhaps are visible, but sometimes not necessarily. And in case of Aernout's work, there's this constant hint to particular developments, not events, but particular developments in the society. But simultaneously, after it has disclosed something, it needs to be capable of telling me that the world can be different. And for me, this kind of irrationality, or I don't know how to find one word that would capture what's happening in this film, is Aernout's work, is potentially a promise of things being otherwise if we invest some sort of speculative or imaginative potential of us as a viewer or of citizen of this world almost. I found a quote by Aernout to close down. You want to say something before
No.
I would like to say something about the terminology of former West. I think that one should also talk about former East. I'm a little bit surprised hearing the whole afternoon geographical positionings of certain countries which are actually in the middle of Europe and actually on the west of the middle of Europe, and then being talked about Eastern Europe. I mean, it's very fun. It's like listening to Americans talking about Belgium being Scandinavia.
Can I say something about it? I tried to explain this afternoon, and I have some witnesses in the room, that the terminology between East and West has nothing to do with geography. It has to do with political constellations in the world. I come from Czechoslovakia. If you would tell me that I come from Eastern Europe, I would get mad. But politically, historically, it belongs to that bloc called.
Yeah, but I mean that's exactly the issue. What I mean, it's in the head of the people. It's,
exactly.
In 1982, there was a exposition West Unst, and if you take that. And if you take that as a starting point, it's still in the heads. It's still this, and that's the problem. Just take the Eurovision Song Festival, and then see how
East Europeans are winning.
Yeah, I mean, and what is the frustration here? I mean, it's a small word, East West, but it's still hugely. It refers to of course, to the Iron Curtain, who was going through West Europe, and then.
Except former West was born out of a new asymmetry born after the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? Previously we had West, East, South, right? And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we suddenly had former East, global South, so that the rephrasing took place, except the West stayed itself the West. And the project Former West is to get in our minds that the change was actually global, and that we need to start recognizing certain changes in our own environment to be able to understand the world the way it is. And it's a proposition. I wish Former West was a reality. For me personally, it's an aspirational horizon far away that we need to work towards. And that's why this project was born, to try to figure out some sort of terminology, try to find other sort of chronologies that we're currently aware of and working with in our heads, try to imagine the world otherwise, to return to that formulation. And I'll have to close this session, but I want to quote those two sentences of what Aernout says about what art can do. Doubt about, and within the situation under discussion. It's not to confirm the situation, it's to put things in doubt. And that is by no means, and that it by no means offers a false pretense that it, the art, knows where the problems reside, who is to blame for them, and how to resolve them. What my work does suggest, however, is that solutions and possibilities of other world do exist.
Well, amen.
That's a good You see, I did find a quote. Thank you for this lively conversation. I enjoyed it.